It's time to reveal my card, and boy, have I been given a doozy of one. So, without further ado, here it is. Servant of Yogg-Saron. 5 mana, 5/4, Battle Cry. Draw 2 cards! Whoa! Alright, if you thought Ancient of Lore was good, boy, a 5 mana, 5/4, draw 2 cards sure looks insane. And that's probably because that's not the card. Here's the card. Battle Cry, gain 5 armor, draw a card. If you thought Shield Maiden looked insane, boy, does this look absolutely insane. That's because this isn't it either. Summon 2/2/3 Spirit Wolves with Taunt. That's 9/10 in stats. Summon 5/1/1 Silverhand Recruits. That's 10/9 in stats. Summon a Huffer? Whoa! Alright, but in actuality, the effect is Battle Cry, deal 4 damage to itself, discard a random card. That kinda sucks. Here's the actual card, realsies this time. 5 mana, 5/4, Servant of Yogg-Saron, Battle Cry, cast a random spell that costs 5 or less, targets chosen randomly. This is just a standalone card. Doesn't really synergize with Yogg-Saron. In fact, that random spell that is cast from the Servant of Yogg-Saron does not count as a spell that is cast for the purposes of Yogg-Saron getting buffed. Nor is it affected by spell damage, nor does it trigger your cards that get triggered when you play a spell, for example, Flame Waker or Mana Worm. So, Servant of Yogg-Saron is just really meant as a solid card, which is strange to say when the effect is so random, but what we're really looking for is for, on average, the card to have a good effect. I wasn't entirely sure how to evaluate a card like this at first, but I am glad that Blizzard sent it to me first so that I could plug in all of these spreadsheets and data of all 185 card effects, spell effects, that are in standard, which cost 5 or less. What I did was I kind of went through every single spell on the list, and I assigned them a category of very good, good, okay, bad, and very bad. The first category is if you play Servant of Yogg-Saron on an empty board or a board in which you have minions already. The second category is when the opponent has 1 minion or several minions on the board, and you have none. Starting from just generically very good, the absolute best effects that you can get from Yogg-Saron are the ones I kind of alluded to already. If the random spell you get happens to be, and there are a few of these, Arcane Intellect, Solemn Vigil, or Nourish, the Big Daddy, draw 3 if you get the random effect of the draw 3 part of Nourish. There's Shield Block, which gains you 5 armor and draws you a card. Feral Spirit, which summons those 2/3 Spirit Wolves with Taunt, probably the best possible summon result. Note that I asked Blizzard how Overload would work. They didn't give me a conclusive answer yet. Stand Against Darkness's massive summon, Animal Companion, is very good as well. Also generally good are Any Secret. Effigy is a particularly good one. Ice Block is fun. And of course you don't have to only get mage ones. How about a Freezing Trap from Hunter? When you play Servant of Yogg-Saron, the situation of how good the random spells are differs based on whether or not you have the minions on the board or whether the opponent has the minions on the board. Because if you have the minions on the board and your opponent has none, buff spells such as Blessing of Kings become very good, giving your Servant of Yogg-Saron a +4/+4 buff if it's the only card on the board when you play it. Or if you get Seal of Champions on it, that's an 8/4 Divine Shield for 5 mana. That's really big. And if you have other minions on the board, then your blessings and your buffs can hit those cards too. Whereas they have no chance to hit the enemy if the enemy has no minions on the board. Whereas if your opponent has minions on the board, cards such as Assassinate or Deadly Shot become much better. Or Sap. So I tabulated my data for 2 simple-ish cases to come up with generally how good Servant of Yogg-Saron was. First case, if you play Yogg-Saron on an empty board, you're going to have a very good result more than 30% of the time. 57 very good results out of 185. 29 good results there. A good result would be a minor good effect that happens. For example, you get the secret competitive spirit into play, or you sinister strike the opponent. An okay result happens when the card is essentially a 5-mana 5/4 with a random effect, such as you get Bolster or Totemic Might. A bad effect happens when you hurt yourself slightly. For example, Servant of Yogg-Saron brings about a Whirlwind, a Backstab, and you get a 5-mana 5/2. And then a very bad category, which has 15 out of 185, which means it happens 8.11% of the time. The worst of the worst would be Soulfire, which has a chance of killing itself and you discard a card, although you could get lucky and then Soulfire could hit the opponent's face and then you discard a card. Power Overwhelming, where if you're playing this on the board and it's itself, you Power Overwhelming it and it does nothing. Astral Communion, which discards your hand. You can do Equality. You can Humility your own Servant of Yogg-Saron. Note that there are more very bad effects when you play Servant of Yogg-Saron on an empty board, because if you play it on a board where your opponent has minions, then cards such as Lightning Bolt have a chance equally of hitting your opponent or his minion. So ultimately, is the card good? Well, according to this data right here, I will say the Servant of Yogg-Saron is a very good card when you randomly get the very good effect. And that very good effect happens 30% plus of the time, no matter what the board state is. A good effect happens another about 16% of the time, which means approximately 50% of the time, Servant of Yogg-Saron, when played, will have either a value equal to or more than what the cost is. When you consider that half of the OK section could be split into 50% bad and 50% good, if you were to just divide that in two, and you put half of that into the good category, then you could add another approximately 20% into the good category, which means that 66% or 2/3 of the time, Servant of Yogg-Saron has a beneficial effect to you, outweighing or equal to its cost as a 5-mana 5/4. Does that make the card good enough? Well, you have to compare the card with something like Ethereal Conjurer, 5-mana 6/3 Battlecry, discover a spell. The pro of this card over Ethereal Conjurer is that the spell you're going to get is cast immediately for free, which means you could have a mana savings of up to 5 if you're going to get some really good 5-drop effect. Then that's amazing, and it's not limited to only mage cards. The big downside, of course, is you're going to cast the spell randomly, and the spell you get is random instead of a choice. Therefore, compared to Ethereal Conjurer, stats are fairly comparable. 5/4 is slightly better than 6/3, I think. But compared to Ethereal Conjurer, this is much more of a tempo card, since you're saving mana by immediately casting the spell. Though it is less of a quality card, because you are not getting the card advantage and the choice of when to play said card. A similar card that you can think of in comparison to this card is Matter Bomber, which has a random effect, and it is also a 5-mana 5/4. Matter Bomber, in the case where you play it onto an empty board, would have a 100% okay situation, since the damage that it deals is randomly dealt to your opponent as well as yourself. And when your opponent has a minion out on the board and you have none, the situation becomes that Matter Bomber becomes a good card. Now, the reason why OK is not acceptable and why Matter Bomber is not very commonly run is that a 5-mana 5/4 is not a good card. So when that is the situation of okayness or an average result, then that's quite bad for Matter Bomber. But fortunately, this card has the odds stacked in your favor. The effect is generally good for you. Even though the spell is random, And I can confidently say that at least about 2/3 of the time, when you play the card, you're going to have something good happen. At least 1/3 of the time, when you play the card, something so good will happen that the card will be a game changer, either in bringing you back or have a much better effect than its cost would dictate. Whether that's good or not requires a lot of practical practice. It's one of those cards that's very difficult to evaluate without playing it. In Arena, I think this card is comparable to Matter Bomber, with the additional flexibility that you can actually play it regardless of whether or not you're ahead or behind on the board. However, it does not have the as consistently good effects of Matter Bomber when you play Matter Bomber on a board that is out of your control. This card will end up just being one of those solid cards in Arena, which you can play whenever you want, and it will certainly have some random effects. But on average, the effect will be good, which means that the card will be generally above average, I would say. Overall, I think the correct way of thinking of this card is a straightforward value card similar to Ethereal Conjurer and Azure Drake, though with a inclination for tempo, because the spell is immediately cast and is free. And that is a very exciting look at the very exciting card, Servant of Yogg-Saron. Go do some number crunching, and I look forward to seeing whether or not your numbers match up with mine, and we'll see in practice whether or not the Servant of Yogg-Saron manages to bring some madness onto the tables of Hearthstone.
Now I've got a tale to tell you of the ones from long ago. There's an evil that's been dreaming, but now it's softly screaming. From the darkness, their power will grow. Their voices are made of poison. When you listen, you are sure to be disturbed. You can lock your doors. You can say your prayers. No creature can resist their wicked words. Never mind, no need to worry. That's all just a story of the whispers of the old gods.